It began, as these things often do, with a silence too loud to ignore. On a mild Tuesday morning in July, Geoffrey Rush, the man who once held audiences captive with a single glance, was found unconscious on the floor of his Paddington home. By the time the ambulance arrived, the damage had been done. He would not speak again. At 74, the actor whose voice once echoed across world stages and Oscar podiums succumbed quietly to a massive stroke. But the true tragedy? It had begun long before the finale. The news spread like a creeping shadow through the corridors of Australia's theatre world, across the Atlantic to London's West End, and deep into Hollywood's golden archives. Geoffrey Rush, that genius of complexity, that mad conductor of character, gone. Or rather, silenced. There was something deeply theatrical about the way it ended. Sudden, irreversible, and oddly poetic. Yet what few knew was that in the months leading up to his death, Rush had been rehearsing something stranger, darker, and far more personal than any role he had ever played. And it all began with a script. 6 months prior, Rush had disappeared from the public eye. His team called it a creative retreat, a harmless euphemism for what insiders were beginning to whisper about. A growing withdrawal, a scattered forgetfulness, a man once known for photographic memory, now struggling to find. He was writing, not a memoir. He'd scoffed at the very idea of self-indulgent literary navel-gazing. No, this was different. According to his close friend and longtime stage director, Elise Morrow, he was crafting what he called his final reckoning, a one-man play, allegedly unfinished, that explored the concept of vanishing, not just from the stage, but from the mind itself. He was obsessed with the idea that memory is just performance, she said, voice cracking on ABC radio. He thought, forget, there were signs, subtle ones, forgotten lines during a radio interview, a missed cue during a charity reading in Melbourne, a strange moment at a dinner party where he repeated a joke he'd just told 10 minutes prior with the exact same cadence. Friends laughed, uneasily. Geoffrey didn't. He looked off, muttering, "That's not right," before retreating to the garden for the rest of the night. Then there was the painting. Rush had always dabbled in visual art, sketching on napkins, oil on canvas, finger smudges on fogged mirrors. But in recent months, he'd become compulsive. One canvas in particular had disturbed those who saw it. A portrait of himself on stage, alone in an empty theater, with eyes blacked out and mouth open mid-scream. In the background, barely visible, were the faint silhouettes of faceless audience members, hundreds of them, blurred like smoke. He called it the witnesses. Those close to him described this period as a haunting. He spoke less, smiled less, and yet, paradoxically, he performed more. He would slip into characters during casual brunches, quoting King Lear while buttering toast, delivering lines from Shine as if giving testimony at the table. One friend confessed, "It was as if he was rehearsing for an exit we couldn't see coming." Then came the day of the fall. A neighbor heard something, a loud thud, then nothing. The ambulance arrived within minutes. No foul play, no substance, just a stroke, sudden and catastrophic. And yet, when paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, they found something curious in his clenched left hand. A crumpled page from his unfinished script, covered in erratic handwriting, half-sentences and one line circled multiple times. How do you bow when no one remembers the show? His passing didn't come immediately. For days he lingered in a coma, while tributes poured in from every corner of the world. Directors recalled his terrifying precision. Co-stars remembered the way he could melt into madness. Students wept over the voice that had narrated their dreams of the stage. But amidst the elegies and headlines, a single question began to stir. What was he trying to say before the silence took him? Some believe that Final Play, found half-complete in his study, holds the answers. Others claim it's nothing more than fragments, hallucinations scrawled in fading ink. His daughter, Angelica, has yet to comment. The Sydney Theatre Company has expressed interest in producing the script as a posthumous piece, but legal hurdles abound. Some of the content, they say, is disturbingly prophetic. Was Geoffrey Rush trying to warn us, or simply document his descent? Had the man who once portrayed Peter Sellers' genius and madness now experienced both sides of the coin in his own skin? It is impossible to say. What is known is this. In those last months, he was no longer acting. He was becoming something else, perhaps the very ghost he once conjured so masterfully on screen. The curtains have closed, the stage lights dimmed. Yet there is no applause, only echoes. And somewhere, in a drawer yet unopened, may lie the last truth he ever told, half written, half lost, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember the show. They say the soul of an actor never truly leaves the stage, that the scent of grease paint, the soft squeak of worn floorboards, the hiss of breath before a monologue, those things linger long after the curtain falls. For Geoffrey Rush, these echoes were not remnants. They were everything. He didn't live to act. He acted to live. And in the final chapter of his life, when memory began to flicker like a faulty spotlight, it was the tiniest of rituals that tethered him to the world. Every morning at 5:30 a.m. Geoffrey made tea. Not with a machine, not with a button or a beeping kettle, but with a battered silver teapot he'd bought in Prague in 1982 during a touring run of the Seagull. Its handle was cracked, the lid dented, but he called it my co-star. He would place it gently on the stove, open the window just enough to feel the bite of morning air, and recite the same line from The Tempest. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises. He'd said it in his sleep once, during an overseas flight. The stewardess thought he was having a stroke then, too, but back then he remembered everything. On his writing desk, the surface was chaos, clippings of reviews, faded programs, a stack of old spectacle magazines and post-it notes with scribbled dialogue from half-finished characters, a washed-up puppeteer, a blind juggler, a memory-impaired king in a nursing home. One note read only, "Do we forget the pain or just the shape of it?" He wrote in pencil, always. Fountain pens, he said, made lies permanent. His cat, Lear, would curl up beside the desk, staring at him as if memorizing lines of its own. Geoffrey had rescued Lear from the gutter behind a community theatre in Hobart during the 2003 tour of Exit the King. "He found me," he'd say with a smirk. Lear didn't purr. He groaned, low and theatrical. It made Geoffrey laugh every time, a sound that had grown rarer in the last 2 years. One afternoon, a close friend visited and found Geoffrey hunched in front of the mirror, silently mouthing words. But his reflection wasn't mimicking him. At least, it didn't seem like it. "It's a trick of the light," he whispered, never breaking eye contact with himself. Or maybe memory, playing a final joke. It was the smaller things that hurt the most. Misplacing a scarf his wife had knit for him during rehearsals of Shakespeare in Love. Forgetting how to tie his shoelaces and instead wrapping them around his ankles like stage bindings. Misreading the labels on his prescription bottles and taking sleeping pills at noon. But when it came to scripts, his own or others, he never forgot a beat. Until he did. At one rehearsal with a young director he admired, Geoffrey blanked in the middle of a line. Not just any line, but one he'd performed for decades. The chilling whisper of Amadeus, the court composer Salieri's final descent into madness. He stood frozen. The young cast watched, wide-eyed, waiting for the master to recover. He didn't. He simply looked up, smiled with a kind of tragic humor, and said, "That's curious. That's very curious indeed." Then he left the room and never returned to that production. In the weeks that followed, he stopped shaving. His beard grew wild and gray, framing his face like a Greek tragedy mask. He began painting more often, quick, abstract smears of reds and purples and deep blacks. They filled his study walls, forming a kind of gallery of storms. But every painting bore the same feature: eyes, hundreds of them, sometimes clear and judging, sometimes weeping, sometimes missing altogether. "Audience," he told a friend, "always watching. Even when I forget, they're there." The neighbors recall seeing him on his balcony late at night, sometimes talking to the wind. Not in sadness, but with purpose, like rehearsing a soliloquy for a crowd just beyond the dark. And sometimes, with Lear perched on the railing beside him, he would perform entire scenes from plays long past. His voice, still magnetic, would rise and crack across the quiet Sydney street. It frightened some. It inspired others. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, a passerby saw him barefoot in the front garden, kneeling in the mud, clutching something in his fist. When asked if he was all right, Geoffrey smiled and said, "Just retrieving a memory I buried here. They sprout after storms." And then there was the dressing room. He'd converted the old guest room into a private sanctuary, mirrors bordered with bulbs, costumes hung neatly like relics, a row of wigs carefully maintained despite not being used for years. There, in solitude, he would become others: the dying king, the bitter poet, the forgotten actor. And in becoming them, he remembered pieces of himself. He once said, "Every time I wear someone else's skin, I sew back a little of my own." It wasn't all shadows. Children still sent him fan mail. He answered each one with crooked handwriting and stickers of theater masks. He wrote, "Never be afraid to pretend. Pretending is remembering with extra color." One child, Olivia from Brisbane, drew him as a superhero with a cape made of scripts. He pinned it to his mirror. When the paramedics found him, it was still there. After the stroke, they say his face remained strangely peaceful, almost as if caught between thoughts, half in this world, half in another. The medical report said it was instantaneous, but those who knew Geoffrey believe he had been preparing for it, rehearsing for it, crafting the final scene. In his drawer was a note not addressed to anyone. It read, "If I am to vanish, let it be with the curtain half drawn, the lights still warm, the echo of my voice trailing off mid-sentence. Don't let them write the end. Let them wonder what came next." And so we wonder, not just about his final days, but about the strange, intimate details, the feel of his teapot's handle, the brushstroke of his haunted portraits, the low growl of Lear in the hall, the creak of floorboards as he stepped into a character one last time. We imagine his fingers trembling over a typewriter key, unsure whether to finish the word or leave it hanging. We imagine it all, because somehow Geoffrey Rush made us part of the story. Not just the audience, the witnesses, the ones still watching, still waiting, still listening for a voice in the dark that once said, "Be not afeared. The aisle is full of noises." And in that noise, maybe he is still performing. There is something uncanny about a man who spends his life becoming other people. You start to wonder where the actor ends and the person begins, if such a border ever existed at all. Geoffrey Rush blurred those lines with terrifying ease, perhaps too well. And now, in the wake of his stroke, in the quiet that follows the applause, questions still hang like suspended dust in a forgotten theater. Questions no one seems able or willing to answer. Take, for instance, the pages. In the drawer of his study, aside from the unfinished script and the child's superhero drawing, were several handwritten sheets. Not journal entries, not letters, but what appeared to be a series of fragmented stage directions. They were written in the third person. Geoffrey Rush, in his own hand, had begun referring to himself as a character. One line, found on the back of a theater flyer from 1989, simply read, "He enters the room as if from another life. He does not remember why he's here, only that it matters terribly." Some pages were stained, others folded multiple times as if hidden, passed around, or taken somewhere and returned. There was no order, no coherence, yet certain words appeared again and again. Vanish, witness, echo, and most unsettling of all, exit before arrival. What did he mean? Some say these were notes for his final performance. Others think they were symptoms, scribbled evidence of a mind unspooling. But Elise Morrow, the only person to have read the full contents of the drawer before it was quietly locked away, refuses to speak in detail. He was working on something complex, she said in a radio interview, choosing her words like glass. Whether it was theater or something else entirely, I can't say. She paused. I'm not sure even he knew. And then there's the phone call. 2 nights before the stroke, Geoffrey dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. The voicemail line for a now-defunct rehearsal space in Perth. No one knew the system still worked. But it did. A technician discovered the message by accident while restoring the old servers for archival use. The voice is unmistakable, weary, slurred, and yet unmistakably Rush. If you get this, I think I've stepped out too far this time. Not sure what's real, not sure what's mine, but it's almost ready. Ready? What was almost ready? The play? The final painting? A confession? Or something else? Then there's the attic. After the funeral, a private, unusually quiet affair with no press and few familiar names, his daughter Angelica returned to his home. She was looking for a first-edition copy of King Lear her father had once promised her. Instead, she found the attic door unlocked for the first time in years. What lay inside has not been publicly disclosed, but sources close to the family say she came down pale, trembling, and refused to speak for several hours. The book, incidentally, was never found. Rumors, of course, thrive in mystery. And in the theater, they multiply like shadows under spotlights. Some claim Rush had been in contact with a group of fringe performers known only as The Resonance, an underground troupe infamous for their immersive, often unsettling performances that blurred reality and fiction. There are whispers that his last script was not a play, but a blueprint, a map, a ritual. One particularly strange theory suggests the performances were rehearsals for death, or rather for what comes after. None of this has been confirmed. But here's what we do know. The final scene in his unfinished script, recovered from beneath a stack of old vinyl records, is no longer than a few lines. No stage direction, no character name, just this. The actor stands in the center. The lights flicker. A sound like breath, but from nowhere. He looks out, not at the audience, but through them. Then he says softly, "You were never watching me. You were watching yourselves. I only showed you how." Then nothing. The rest of the page is blank. Of course, the rational explanation is memory loss, confusion, a great mind slipping beneath the surface. But why, then, does so much of what he left behind feel intentional, too orchestrated to be random, too poetic to be accident? And why did so many who knew him best speak in half-sentences, in cryptic hints, as though even in death he had instructed them to maintain the performance? The Sydney Theatre Company announced, weeks later, that no tribute performance would be held. Out of respect for his wishes, the press release read. But Geoffrey had made no known will, no instructions, no final requests. Not on paper. And then there was the letter, delivered anonymously to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, typewritten on old paper, no return address. It read, "You buried the man, but the role remains. Look to where the light meets the dust. That's where he's waiting." It was unsigned, but theater scholars claim the phrasing matches a monologue Rush performed in a 1994 Fringe adaptation of The Tempest, a production long lost to time, with no known recordings. Stranger still, several people, neighbors, friends, even a former stagehand, have since claimed to see Geoffrey Rush, not in dreams, but in waking life. A glimpse of his silhouette crossing the stage of the empty State Theatre. A reflection in a backstage mirror at the wharf. A man in a long coat reciting lines from Amadeus in a train station toilet stall. One security guard claims he heard singing in the foyer long after the building had closed. A single voice, low and clear. "Do you believe in curtains or only walls?" We could dismiss all of this, of course, chalk it up to grief, to nostalgia, to the tendency of the mind to preserve genius by refusing to let it fade. But the truth, whatever it may be, is still unwritten. Maybe Geoffrey Rush's greatest performance wasn't Salieri, or Peter Sellers, or King Lear. Maybe it was this, a slow, deliberate vanishing act, woven from bits of memory, ritual, illusion, and silence. A final role where the audience doesn't know when to clap, or even if the show is truly over. And so we wait for the lost script, for the echo in the rafters, for the moment when, perhaps, someone finds the lights still warm and wonders if he ever really left. In the weeks that followed Geoffrey Rush's passing, or disappearance as some had come to phrase it, something began to shift. Not in the grand, thunderous way death tends to announce itself, but in quiet ripples. A single seat left open at the Opera House during sold-out performances. A bouquet of dried eucalyptus found on the stage of a closed theater. A shadow in press photos where no one had stood. Things that could be dismissed, explained, reasoned with, and yet weren't. The media tried to move on. Obituaries had been written, tributes aired, awards renamed. The industry needed closure, but the people closest to him, the ones who had seen the small changes that in the months leading up to the stroke, the ones who had heard the strained rehearsals, the midnight monologues, the soft pacing in otherwise silent rooms, they could not close the curtain. Not yet, not entirely. Take, for instance, the theater in Fremantle, a place he'd once described as the womb of his ambition. Long shut down, scheduled for demolition, it had been a sanctuary for many of his early performances. One night, during a routine site inspection, workers reported hearing piano music. Not from speakers, not a radio, a piano. And not just any music. A few recognized the melody as David Helfgott's Rachmaninoff, the same piece Rush had famously portrayed in Shine. The building had no power. They returned the next morning, nothing. But on the old, dust-covered stage, someone had drawn a chalk line in the shape of a doorway. No footprints. No explanation. Perhaps the mind seeks meaning where there is none. Perhaps grief is a stage play that keeps writing itself, long after the actors have left. But then again, Geoffrey had once said, half joking, half not, "I don't want to be remembered. I want to be replayed." And replayed he was. Clips of his films surged in popularity. Old theater footage resurfaced. Forgotten interviews were picked apart by armchair philosophers and would-be biographers, all hoping to uncover some overlooked line, some hidden code. A quote, perhaps, that explained the unfinished script, or the voice message, or the strange mirrors in his attic, positioned not to reflect oneself, but to reflect each other. In one interview from 2007, when asked what scares him most, Geoffrey leaned forward and said, "Waking up in the middle of a standing ovation and realizing I don't remember the play." At the time, it was met with laughter. Now it plays differently. Then came the letter, or, more precisely, the second letter, postmarked from Tasmania, no return name, typed on the same kind of machine as the first. It read, "The performance was never meant for them. It was for the ones behind the light. The watchers who forget they're watching. Ask the cat." For a moment, the world turned its attention to Lear, his cat, his shadow, his last companion. But Lear had vanished too. A neighbor claimed to have seen the animal in a cemetery near Rush's home, curled on a grave not his. Another said it appeared for a moment on the roof of the old theater in Balmain, eyes glowing, before vanishing into the dark. Conspiracy? Projection? Theatrics? Possibly. But then there's Angelica. She remained publicly silent for months, avoiding all requests for interviews. But during a panel about legacy at a literary festival, she said this, "I don't think my father died. I think he disappeared into his story. He always said the best actors never leave the stage. They simply find a new role, one the audience doesn't know how to see." The audience laughed politely, but she did not. When asked about the attic, she paused for an unnatural beat, then replied, "There are some doors you only open once." That was all. And what of the witnesses, the painting? It had vanished too, removed from his studio the night before the stroke. No security footage, no sale, no trace. But months later, an image resembling it, not a photo, but a sketch, loose and frantic, appeared as the cover of an anonymous, self-published zine sold in Newtown. No title, no author. Just one line scrawled beneath the eyes of the faceless crowd. "You are here because you remember." What are we remembering? Geoffrey Rush's life, certainly, but is that all? Or are we remembering a version of him he wanted us to see? A performance so layered, so convincingly blurred with truth, that even now, we aren't entirely sure if the final bow has happened, or if it ever will. There are still unanswered questions, like why his study door locks from the outside, why his home phone dials an extension not linked to any known number, why no trace of his final script exists in digital form, why the mirror in his old dressing room still fogs in the shape of a handprint, though no one uses it anymore, and above all, why so many who knew him say the same thing. It feels like he's still somewhere, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the ending was never supposed to feel final. Maybe the true performance was never confined to film reels or stage lights. Maybe it was unfolding all along, just out of sight, between the lines of a forgotten script, in the echo of applause that never quite fades. You might find yourself replaying scenes, rewatching, rereading, listening more closely to the silences between words, the pauses in monologues, the slow fade to black. And, in those moments, you may start to feel it too. That odd sensation, as if someone is still performing, somewhere just behind the curtain, whispering lines not meant to be heard but felt. And when you do, don't applaud, just listen.